This is the story of how one small country broke one of the greatest empires in history. In the 1970s, the USSR was a titan, spanned over 66 million square miles, controlled over 25% of all the Earth's landmass, and was home to 1/6 of the entire world's population. But that didn't stop the Soviets from feeling like outsiders. You see, after World War II, Europe was pretty much under Soviet control. But there was one part of Europe that refused to bow down to Moscow: Afghanistan. In December of 1979, the Soviets would send in troops to put down a rebellion. And what followed was a decade-long war that ultimately bankrupted an empire and led to the collapse of the USSR. This is the series, Legacy. And today, we are answering the question, how did the Soviet-Afghan War bankrupt an empire? Part 1. Invasion. In 1973, government of Afghanistan was overthrown in a non-violent coup d'etat by a group of army officers who wanted the country to move towards democracy. A coup, but their rule was short-lived. In April of 1978, a group known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA for short, came into power. They were a communist party with Soviet backing, and they quickly began to push through some very extreme reforms. The country was renamed the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, and many of the traditional customs and institutions of the country were abolished. Women's rights were expanded, and the government began to nationalize many of the industries and collectivize agriculture. Now, these reforms were seen as a direct attack on the traditional values of Afghan society, which was highly influenced by religion and tribalism. This caused a lot of resentment and anger amongst the general population, especially in the rural areas where the majority of the country lived. The PDPA tried to crack down on this opposition, but they were unable to do so without the help of the Soviet Union. So that's exactly what they did. On December, Soviet troops crossed into Afghanistan and quickly began to put down the rebellion. Within 3 days, Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, was in Soviet hands. The rebels were soon pushed out of the city, and the war seemed to be going well for the Soviets. But as time went on, things started to change. Part 2. Stalemate. The Soviet victory at Kandahar was short-lived. You see, unlike their Western counterparts, the Soviet troops weren't necessarily eager to fight in Afghanistan. Many of them were conscripts who had been drafted into the army against their will. And even those who had volunteered were not properly trained or equipped for combat. This lack of morale and military preparedness became glaringly obvious when the Soviets attempted to advance further into the country. The mountainous terrain of Afghanistan made it nearly impossible for the Soviet tanks and other heavy equipment to maneuver. On top of that, the Afghan people who had been resisting the Soviets from the start launched a series of guerrilla attacks against the Soviet supply lines and military bases. These attacks were effective because the Afghan people knew the terrain better than the Soviets, and they were fighting for their homeland, whereas the Soviets were just trying to prop up a foreign government. As the war dragged on, the Soviets found themselves bogged down in a stalemate. They were unable to make any significant gains against the Afghan resistance. Yet, they were also unable to withdraw from the country without losing face. At this point, it seemed that the only solution was to escalate the war and fully invade Afghanistan. But why? What was the Soviet objective in Afghanistan? To answer that question, let's take a look at what was happening around the world at the time. Part 3. The Cold War. By the late 1970s, the Cold War was heating up. The United States was in the midst of a military buildup and had recently taken down an airplane carrying hundreds of unarmed Cuban refugees. Just 2 years earlier, they had also overthrown a democratically elected government in Chile and installed a brutal dictator in its place. And in 1975, they had pulled out of the important anti-ballistic missile treaty, which limited each side's ability to develop anti-ballistic missiles. In response to all this, the Soviet Union began to seek out allies around the world who could counterbalance the growing American influence. One such ally was Afghanistan, When the PDPA came into power in Afghanistan, they reached out to the Soviets for support. And when they were threatened by rebel forces, the Soviets felt compelled to step in and help them out. This was partly because the Soviets genuinely believed in the PDPA's socialist agenda and wanted to see it succeed. But it was also part of a larger strategy to contain American influence in the region. You see, up until this point, the Middle East had been largely under U.S. control, but the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which overthrew another U.S.-backed dictator and replaced him with an Islamic fundamentalist regime, showed the Soviets that there was an opportunity to make inroads into the region. If they could successfully support the PDPA and install a communist government in Afghanistan, then they would have a beachhead from which they could operate and potentially challenge American hegemony in the Middle East. Unfortunately for the Soviets, the Afghan people had other plans. Part 4. Bankruptcy. As the war dragged on, it became clear that the Soviets were not going to be able to achieve their objectives in Afghanistan. Despite pouring in thousands more troops, they were still not able to make any real progress against the Afghan resistance. To make matters worse, the war was extremely costly. Every day that the war went on, the Soviets were burning through billions of rubles. This was money that could have been used to improve the lives of Soviet citizens, but instead it was being wasted on foreign wars. As the financial burden of the war became too much to bear, the Soviet government began to cut back on spending in other areas. This led to widespread shortages of food, consumer goods, and raw materials. To make matters even worse, the war was a propaganda nightmare for the Soviets. The Afghan people had been able to turn the war into a national and international issue, portraying the Soviets as nothing more than foreign invaders. This portrayal was extremely effective, especially in the West, where most people had no interest in the internal politics of Afghanistan. All they saw was a small nation bravely resisting a foreign invader. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan would become known as the 10-Year War, lasting from 1979 to 1989. Throughout that decade, millions of Afghans and Soviets died. Millions more were wounded or displaced. And in the end, neither side was able to claim a decisive victory. Finally, in February of 1989, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving behind a nation that was devastated by war and a legacy that would eventually lead to the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. In conclusion, the Soviet-Afghan War bankrupted an empire because it was a war that the Soviets could not win. Despite their overwhelming military superiority, they were unable to defeat the Afghan resistance, who were better equipped for the type of warfare that was taking place. The war was extremely costly for the Soviets, both in terms of money and lives, and it led to widespread shortages of food and other goods within the Soviet Union. The war also turned out to be a propaganda nightmare for the Soviets, who were portrayed as nothing more than foreign invaders. In the end, the war led to the bankruptcy of the Soviet Empire and the collapse of the USSR. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to leave a like. Also, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching.